Hello, good morning. Could you all hear me? Yes, excellent. It's great to be here. Thank you, Niall. Thank you for organising this, and thanks for the introduction. Well done for those of you who've made it on time. It was a bit of a marathon getting here this morning, wasn't it? So sorry. So the sort of pun my dad makes. But anyway, great that you're all here, and I'm looking forward to today. I hope what I have to present today will make your trip worth it. I know for a fact the other presenters will make your trip worth it, but I hope mine will also be of use and interest to all of you. Now, before I get on with my presentation, I'd just like to say just a few words about me and who I am and my background and so on and so forth. So, my name's Джеймс Ντέιβις. My doctorate was in medical and social anthropology, focusing on mental health. And I've trained as a psychotherapist, an adult psychotherapist, and indeed practiced as a therapist in different organisations, such as the NHS, and also for the organisation Mind. When I worked for the NHS, I worked in an outpatient psychotherapy unit, receiving referrals from the wards and also from primary care. And it was while working in that setting that I started to become quite concerned with some of the more traditional forms of psychiatric intervention and practice that I was witness to. For example, when it came to psychiatric diagnoses, I often found that these diagnoses created the illusion of understanding among me and my peers. I also felt that these diagnoses were generating stigma in the people I was working with, and also leading them to become confused about the real nature of their distress. When it came to the psychiatric medications, while it is true, and I certainly subscribe to this notion, that for some people, the most severely distressed members of our society, these medications can be experienced as very useful, certainly when taken in the short term, and I accept that principle. For me, working in the NHS, it felt that there was a huge amount of unnecessary over-prescribing. And in addition to that, a lot of prescribing that was going on for far too long. Prescribing that ultimately, in my view, was doing more harm than good. So as a consequence of these experiences, which I culminated over a series of years, I started to read voraciously the critical psychiatry literature to find out a little bit more about what potentially could be going wrong. And after a few years of consulting this literature, I decided personally to make my own contribution to this particular canon. And I decided to do that by way of not writing an academic article for clinicians and for fellow academics, but rather for writing the kind of book I felt the people I was seeing in the room might benefit from reading. So I wanted to write a book for the general reader in order to reach the people who were on the receiving end of psychiatric drugs and diagnoses. Because in my view, it felt that many such people were subjecting themselves to psychiatric interventions without having the satisfactory information in order to make an informed decision as to whether or not to subject themselves to this form of intervention. And that's why I decided to write the book I did, to provide them with that information I felt they needed in order to make an informed choice as to whether to subject themselves to these interventions or not. So that book, that project culminated in a book called Cracked: Why Psychiatry is Doing More Harm Than Good. And I published that a few years ago. And when it was published, and I think still today, that book advanced a position that is both countercultural and counterintuitive. The position goes like this: that psychiatry over the last 30 years, under the dominance of the biomedical model, has started to become bad for our mental health. Now, there are a number of reasons why I argue this to be the case. I'm just going to focus on two quickly before focusing on one in particular in the first part of my lecture today. The first reason is that psychiatric drugs do not do what they say they do on the tin. they're more ineffectual and dangerous than many of us have been led to suppose. The second point is that the links between the pharmaceutical industry and psychiatry have become far too cozy in recent decades, and this has biased psychiatry towards privileging psychopharmaceutical treatments in the management of emotional distress. And indeed, that is the argument I'm going to focus on in particular in the second part of today's lecture. The final point I want to make, and this is the one I'm going to focus on in the first part of today's lecture, is that psychiatry has wrongly medicalized more and more people in contemporary society. So apparently, 1 in 4 of us now suffers from a mental health disorder in any given year. And I'm going to argue that this figure is so startlingly high because psychiatry has simply renamed more and more of our natural and normal, albeit painful human experiences as indicating psychiatric disorders that oftentimes require some kind of psychiatric drug. So in effect, by reclassifying painful normality as psychiatric abnormality, we have created the illusion of a psychiatric epidemic. Now, I'm not suggesting here that the suffering itself is illusory. No, that is absolutely real. It demands attention and it demands care. What I'm contesting is the notion that this suffering is psychiatric in nature. Okay. So, what is at the heart of this illusion? Well, I'm going to argue today that at the heart of this illusion sits a book called the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the book that includes all of the mental disorders that psychiatry believes to exist. Now, there are many interesting things about this book, but one in particular that stands out for me is that this book has expanded at a faster rate than almost any other medical manual in history. So, for example, in the early 1960s, this book included around 100 disorders, whereas today it includes around 370. So what is going on? Well, that's the question I set out to answer in part of the book I was writing, but I encountered an immediate problem, and it was this. There was very little documentary evidence chartering the processes that the committees who wrote DSM followed when they put that manual together. So I quickly realized, if I were to write some kind of reconstruction of events, then I would have to go and speak to the people who wrote DSM. And that's what I did. I started with someone called Dr. Robert Spitzer, who's now generally regarded to be the most influential psychiatrist of the 20th century because he was chairperson of DSM-III, published in 1980. He headed a team of around 9 people, which was called the task force, remember that phrase, the task force, who wrote and put that manual together. Now, the reason I'm going to start with DSM-III today, and by the way, there have been 5 editions of DSM over its history, the most recent being DSM-V, published in May 2013. But the reason I'm going to start with DSM-III is because by far it is the most important edition in the manual's history for the following reasons. It established the modern diagnostic system under which we still operate today. So we call it the checklist system. If you experience this number of symptoms for this amount of time, then you warrant this diagnosis, right? That checklist system was created in DSM-III. Number 2, DSM-III introduced 80 brand new mental disorders, many of the household name disorders with which you may be familiar. Disorders like attention deficit disorder, or post-traumatic stress disorder, or major depression, etc., and so forth. And finally, DSM-III significantly lowered the bar for what constitutes having one of these disorders. In other words, it made it far easier to get diagnosed with a psychiatric disorder. So for these reasons, I'm going to focus on DSM-III first before moving on to DSM-IV.